Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Charles Koch Institute's special event on occupational licensing in New Hampshire. My name is William Ruger, and I'm the Vice President of Research and Policy at the Charles Koch Institute, and I'm really happy to be here. Some of you know this from last year when we had events on foreign policy and criminal justice reform, that I'm a native of New Hampshire, so I'm coming back to my home state. I was born in Portsmouth and raised in Plastow, and have family throughout the state, so I'm always happy to come back here, come home in many ways, and to see folks, many of whom I know from a variety of events we've done up here, and I'm really excited to be here. Longtime collaborator Jason Sorens on the panel is here, so it's always good to see friends. So thank you all for coming out, and for those of you who I've not met, looking forward to meeting you afterwards during the cocktails and really getting to know you and talking about this important issue. So with that, I just want to say a little bit about the Charles Koch Institute for those of you who don't know much about it. But the Charles Koch Institute is an educational institution whose mission is really to kind of foster a debate and a discussion about the types of policies and institutions and ideas that help promote individual and societal well-being. And it's really apropos, given our interest in human flourishing, to talk about an issue like occupational licensing. And this is an issue that's arisen around the country, and it's really a transpartisan, non-ideological issue where lots of people have come together and said, how can we create a better system in which people can improve their lives, the lives of their families, and to add value to other people's lives through their work? And what are those barriers to opportunity that we see out there? And occupational licensing is one of those issues that I think a lot of well-meaning people have come together and said, let's re-examine these institutions and talk about the ways in which they may help or they may harm people's ability to improve their lives. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to our moderator to introduce himself and the panel. But I want to thank you for coming out here again. It didn't snow like it did last year, but that wouldn't have bothered any Granite Staters, right? Exactly. I mean, so I really appreciate, though, that you came out, and we're really excited to come back to New Hampshire, so thank you.
Thank you, Will, and thanks to the Charles Koch Institute for putting tonight's panel together. My name is Bosse. I'm the editorial page editor for the New Hampshire Union Leader and Sunday News, available at newsstands everywhere at unionleader.com. Do you know the difference between a good haircut and a bad haircut? It's about 2 weeks. Fortunately, the state of New Hampshire has set up a bureaucracy to protect consumers from the threat of a bad hair day. Licensing and fees and classroom requirements, so that you need to get permission to cut somebody else's hair. Occupational licensing is an issue that's gaining prominence among conservatives who want free market solutions, from liberals who see it as a barrier to entry for people at the low end of the economic ladder. Why is this tool of consumer protection seemingly becoming more widely used, even as consumers are better equipped than ever to protect themselves? It's something we're going to address tonight with tonight's panel. It includes Ryan Nunn, a fellow in economic studies and policy director for the Hamilton Project at the Brookings Institution. Last summer, Nunn published Occupational Licensing and the American Worker, an economic analysis of the impact on the increasing prevalence of occupational licensing requirements in the United States. Jason Sorens is a lecturer in the Department of Government and program director of the Political Economy Project at Dartmouth College, my alma mater, and an affiliated scholar with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. His annual report, Freedom in the 50 States, uses occupational licensing requirements as one of several indicators of a state's level of freedom. Ed Timmons is an associate professor of economics and director of the Center for the Study of Occupational Regulation at St. Francis University. He is one of the world's leading scholars on the effects of occupational regulation. And Dana Witt is a senior research fellow at the Charles Koch Institute, tonight's sponsors. Wade spent several years on Capitol Hill, most recently as the deputy staff director for the U.S. Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. Please join me in welcoming our panel. Now, Ryan, your paper talked about the increasing use of occupational licensing in the states. Is it really increasing? Are legislators putting more licensing requirements on more professions?
Sure. So just first, thanks so much to the Charles Koch Institute and to Dana and the team for having me here. Yes, I think we've learned from some work by Professor Morris Kleiner and others that occupational licensing has become much more common in the last 50 or 60 years. It's grown from about 5% of the workforce to something closer to 25% now. And one thing that I think we've learned, an important contribution in a joint White House and Treasury report from about a year and a half ago, was that for the most part, this is actually due to new occupations becoming newly licensed. So it's not just a question of doctors and lawyers and other kind of already licensed service professionals becoming more common in the labor market. It's actually state legislatures having other occupations become licensed.
Jason, your freedom in the 50 states gives high marks to New Hampshire. We're a very free state. How do we rank for occupational licensing?
We're in the middle. So New Hampshire actually doesn't do all that well on occupational licensing by our standards. There was a survey done last year, cited in the White House report, of all 50 states that asked basically how many people require a license for the job that they do. And in New Hampshire, that number was actually fairly low, but I find that is pretty misleading. So the number in New Hampshire is around 14%. About 14% of the workforce say they need a license for the job they do. Now, why is that misleading? And actually, this reason also implies that this 25% of the workforce number is also sort of an understatement of the impact of occupational licensing. Well, the reason why it's an understatement is that if you have really strict occupational licensing restrictions that make it hard to enter professions, so for instance in New Hampshire, you have to undertake 1,500 hours of education to become a cosmetologist. So that's a lot of education, takes over a year to complete that. Well, if those restrictions keep people out of those professions, then fewer people will report having a license in the job that they do because they are kept out of those licensed occupations. So actually, if we look at other measures of licensing in New Hampshire, we see that's much more prevalent. One way we did this was to look at the laws in New Hampshire. We looked for instances of phrases like license required or certification required or no person shall practice or shall not practice. These phrases tend to be associated with requirements that you get a license, pass examinations, take lots of education before you're allowed to practice a trade. Well, what we found is that there are over 200 such mentions in the New Hampshire statutes, and that's quite a bit more than in Vermont or Massachusetts. It's a little bit less than in Maine. And so we see that actually New Hampshire does have a lot of occupational licensing. We also find that the prevalence of occupational licensing in New Hampshire and in other states has roughly doubled over the last decade and a half. So this is a growing problem in New Hampshire, although it may be known as a state having the New Hampshire advantage. When it comes to occupational regulation, it's really just in the middle of the pack.
Ed, are there any New Hampshire occupations that strike you as out of the mainstream? Until a few years ago, we had a license to be a shampooer's assistant.
Yes.
Because, I mean, that unless you're using the no-tier stuff, that can be very dangerous. That got repealed recently, but is there any other area where New Hampshire is requiring licenses that most other states have?
Yes, there are a couple of anomalies. Every state, I think, has potentially some work to do on this issue. For instance, if you take a look at massage therapists, massage therapists are a profession I've done some research on. New Hampshire has one of the more stringent licensure requirements for massage therapists, requiring aspiring massage therapists to complete 175 days of education. Bordering state Vermont has no such requirement. An individual can work as a massage therapist without completing any educational requirements. And it's interesting to note that in New Hampshire, it takes 175 days to become licensed as a massage therapist, yet it only takes 26 days to become licensed as an emergency medical technician. So it's a 7 times difference with respect to looking at these professions. With respect to opticians, interestingly enough, as it turns out, opticians is another. Opticians, by the way, these are just the folks that are adjusting your contact lenses, making sure that your eyeglasses fit appropriately. They're not doing any surgery. In Vermont, an individual that would like to work as an optician requires 2 years of education. Yet in New Hampshire, an individual can work as an optician, also in my home state, Pennsylvania, an individual can work as an optician without undergoing any training. There's no need to, there's no requirement to go forth with any such training. And even at higher end professions, you see some interesting anomalies. Occupational licensing, we're talking about cutting hair and so forth. If you look at medical professions, for instance, nurse practitioners. In New Hampshire, a nurse practitioner has a lot more autonomy than they do in Vermont. A nurse practitioner can prescribe controlled substances without having a physician present. In Vermont, they cannot. Yet, if you look at physical therapists, in New Hampshire, physical therapists have a lot more restrictions placed upon them. If you would like to go and see a physical therapist, if you're having some pain in your back and you'd like to go see a physical therapist rather than going to see a physician, you're only allowed to see that physical therapist for 25 days in New Hampshire, and then you have to go and see a physician. In Vermont, there's no such restriction. So even at the higher end, there's some really interesting differences that can be noted. And documenting these differences so that the public, so that policymakers can have a good understanding of what these laws look like is exactly what we're trying to do at the Center for the Study of Occupational Regulation. We're hoping that we will, by this summer, have online a database for health occupations, and it will only grow from there. We're focusing on health professions right now, and we hope to expand to some others. Where you do see some agreement between New Hampshire and Vermont, both states require hair braiders to become cosmetologists in order to practice. There's quite a few states that let hair braiders get a license without meeting the same requirements. There's a number of states that let hair braiders work without a license.
Again, that's 1,500 hours. Is that what you said,
Yeah.
Jason?
But
I'm a cosmetologist.
I'm very glad to learn that shampooers in New Hampshire can lather without a license.
As long as they don't have scissors.
That's
It can
right.
be dangerous. Yeah, what's the big deal? If somebody really wants a job as a manicurist or a taxidermist or a high school basketball coach, they'll do the paperwork and they'll get what they're doing. New Hampshire's got really low unemployment. What's wrong with a couple of tests to protect consumers?
I think that the important point here to remember is who does occupational licensing affect? And generally, it affects low to moderate income professions. So it's denying those individuals who can afford these training requirements, these fees, these special schools, these taking exams, denying those specific individuals who can afford it the least the opportunity to climb the economic ladder. And that's why we care about it. But I will also say that in today's age, never underestimate the ability of the consumer to cut through red tape. That's exactly what some of the innovations that we've all lived through, and I'm amazed to see some of them. But just thinking about Yelp, Angie's List, even Uber. When was the last time you got into an Uber that had lower than 3 stars? When was the last time you went to a restaurant that had 2 stars on Yelp, or went to a nail salon that had 1 star? Never underestimate the ability of the consumer and market innovations to overcome some of the obstacles when it comes to presenting information. And in fact, they do it in real time, where a lot of these licensing boards are very slow. It takes time. The consumer can act very quickly, and really the markets are kind of the best at handling subpar services.
Open this up to the panel. Can the reputation economy provide a more powerful, more rapid way to weed out bad vendors than licensing, where maybe you come back in 3 or 4 years and reapply, or in some cases, once you've got the license, that's it. The state never looks at you again. You're free to practice forever. Does the reputation economy make some of those barriers obsolete?
I mean, I think it could certainly help. And you know, we need to consider the possibility of combining the two, right? So an alternative that's available to legislators, if they don't want to go all the way toward repealing a license, would be to enact what's called certification, or sometimes it's called a title regulation as opposed to a practice regulation. And so what a title regulation does is it simply says you may not call yourself a certified X, like a certified massage therapist, unless you undertake these requirements. And so it's a way of informing the customer while also allowing willing buyers and sellers to get together without getting the certification. And obviously the prices are going to be cheaper, just as, you know, if you got your hair cut by a cosmetology student, you probably get a break on the price, and maybe the haircut wouldn't be as good, but you know what you're getting, right? And so this is something that legislators could consider if they don't want to go all the way to repeal a license.
And you mentioned Uber. This is what happens when, you know, the licensed economy meets the unlicensed reputation economy, in that the taxi drivers are going to kick and scream that they had to go through this obstacle course. They went through these barriers to get where they are. And now somebody else is going to come in and they don't have to go through the same steps they did. That it's simply a matter of fairness that everybody lives up to the same standard. How do we handle those?
I always ask the question now, you know, what is the difference between getting a license and having an optional certification? So if you want to go through those requirements, and if you want, and there is an argument definitely to be made, you've earned your place, you've gone through all this training, you've paid your fees, but, you know, is it something that requires a government mandated, where the government, basically law enforcement, can come in and shut your business down? Is it something that requires law enforcement and the government to come in and mandate something? Or is it something that an optional certification could solve? And I think in a lot of these cases where, you know, consumers may demand more training, I don't know, there could be some kind of a price, you know, tiering of prices or price discrimination that occurs as part of that. You know, that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing, different prices for different services. But, you know, I think in terms of, is it something that should be mandated versus could it be an optional certification or kind of a third-party certification? Would that solve that problem?
Mm-hmm. Some high-end professions have their own certification. The state has farmed out to lawyers, for instance. The state bureaucracy, but for the most part, it's the Bar Association that disciplines lawyers. Doctors are subject to state regulation, but for the most part, it's other doctors that hold them accountable. Now, those are obviously mandatory, not optional. You can't be, well, there's actually one provision in New Hampshire law where you can represent people without being a lawyer, but for the most part, if you want to practice as a lawyer, the Bar Association has to let you. Is there a functional difference between a licensing requirement and a mandatory certification, where you have to have this private group forcing membership?
So I would actually argue that there can be a problem with that sort of self-regulation of the profession, and we saw this in the Supreme Court case, the North Carolina dental case, where it was essentially held that the state couldn't delegate its authority quite as expansively as it had to the dentists to regulate themselves, and in particular they were not just regulating dentists, but they were regulating other folks who were engaged in, you know, teeth whitening services and things that sort of overlapped with what the dentists were doing. So, you know, I would argue that we want to be careful about vesting the power to regulate the profession and to erect barriers to entry in the people who have a sort of a vested interest in you know, in maintaining those high barriers that sort of keep wages high in the profession.
So you could have one group of teeth whiteners that is 4 out of 5 dentists recommend, and another that's off on their own. They don't have a little blue check mark next to them, but they can maybe have some other way for consumers to know that they're doing a good job.
And I would just quickly wholeheartedly endorse the you know, licensing should be thought of as a last resort when it comes to occupational regulation, and voluntary certification is often a great alternative.
What about the public safety argument that if we don't have some basic standards in place for some of these professions? There was a debate when I was working in the state Senate over mold inspections, that if you just have, you know, your local handyman come in looking for mold, they're going to miss something, you're going to breathe dirty air. It's a public health concern to make sure that we get somebody with the proper training in there to protect consumers who don't know what to look for in terms of mold inspection.
I mean, I think that's a potentially legitimate reason for regulation. The question is whether occupational licensing is in all these cases the most appropriate means to that end, right? So you could license mold inspectors, or you could regulate the methods that they use, or require some sort of record keeping. This is what we did, right? This available to state inspectors. You see this also with things like well drilling. So New Hampshire licenses well drillers. Maybe there's a public health or public interest justification for that. Wells could reduce the water table or something like that. But maybe you could simply regulate the types of wells that you're allowed to install rather than requiring a license to be a well driller. So you just have to consider what is the most effective and least onerous means of achieving this end.
Jason, you do some work for the Mercatus Center. One of your colleagues there from Clemson University, Bruce Yandel, I always remember, came to lecture us when I was working on the Hill. He popularized the phrase bootleggers and Baptists. That there are two groups who love prohibition, the Baptists who didn't want drinking, and the bootleggers who didn't want competition. We have a bootleggers and Baptists problem here in that the incumbent firms have no interest whatsoever in lowering barriers to enter their profession.
Yeah, and I think this is the reason why you see occupational licensing as the chosen means of these interest groups getting what they want, rather than something like simply giving us money, right? So if you're a plumber, you might say, I want the taxpayers to give me money. But lobbying the legislature for a special plumber subsidy is probably not going to be very politically effective. But if you can wrap it in consumer interest, right, I'm doing this for public safety, then you're much more likely to get what you want. You get the Baptists on your side, so to speak. So it would, in fact, be really surprising if states did not over-regulate occupational entry. Why? Well, because consumers don't get active, right? I see there are some legislators in the crowd. You can sort of think about, when licensing bills have come up, do you see consumers testifying on these bills at committee? Do they come in and say, well, I'm worried about the price of this going up in the future? No, it's always the practitioners who show up, right? And often very vocal about it.
I think that's a good point. And when have we known a consumer group to be particularly shy when they want something?
Yeah, so it's just, the people who are potentially harmed by these regulations aren't represented in the political process, whereas the people who can benefit are. And so we should just simply expect the political process to yield probably too much of this kind of legislation.
Ryan, have you found any evidence that these barriers prop up quality and thus wages? So, keep I hate picking on the haircutters today, but keeping bad barbers out, that what's left are better barbers, they can make more money.
So this is it's a tricky thing to study, and so I would draw a sharp distinction between the types of variation that we've talked about already in this panel. So there will be a state where nurse practitioners can operate autonomously, and then a state where they can't. And when you compare those states, you can see there's just, to my knowledge, no evidence that states that allow a kind of wider scope of practice for nurse practitioners, no evidence that that results in lower quality services or any kind of public harm to public safety. That's not to say that there's no quality benefit to the kinds of licensure that's completely universal across the states. So that's what I would caution. I think what we know based on the evidence is that in where we do see variation, where we don't have everyone licensed in the same way, we don't see evidence of quality benefits. It would be harder for me to say, that heart surgery, where it's licensed universally and in very similar ways across the states, it would be hard to say anything about the benefits or the cost of licensure from that, just because we don't see sort of the alternative.
We're going to have the opportunity to ask questions. If you've got a question, raise your hand. They'll bring a mic around to you, and when you're ready, we'll call on you. So you've got the Charles Koch Institute talking about this. You've got the Obama administration putting out a report on this. Why aren't these barriers falling? Why aren't these licensure requirements falling in every state?
I I think first there are a lot of them, and there are a lot of vested interests who care about them. This is a very, very difficult thing. I mean, I think that's why there are some suggestions if you want to ease the burdens of occupational licensing. You know, one way to do it would be perhaps take a look at it comprehensively. Look at Sunset Commission, look at Sunrise Commission. So, you know, kind of what are the gates in terms of if you're establishing a new occupational licensing, first prove that it is necessary. Prove that the benefits exceed the cost. You know, and then certainly taking another comprehensive look in terms of something like a Sunset Commission, looking at occupational licensing kind of on a comprehensive basis, whole cloth, taking a look at a lot of licenses at one time to again do that cost-benefit analysis. And also look at what is the cost to consumers. But I think honestly it really is because there are some pretty powerful interests who get together, really care about these things. It's one of those situations where the benefits, you know, the benefits are very concentrated, the costs are very diffuse across society, and specifically for low to moderate income professions.
Yeah, just quickly on this. One state that has a very effective Sunrise review, and often these reviews are not very effective, at least from what I can tell, trying to look at this across the states. I don't find that states that just have a Sunrise requirement or a Sunset requirement have less licensing. And by the way, just to clarify, a Sunrise requirement or a Sunrise review means that when there's a new proposal for licensing, it has to get some sort of independent review before the legislature acts on it. A sunset review requirement says that a license will automatically expire after a certain number of years unless the legislature chooses to reauthorize it. Apparently for most states, these are not very effective. But one state that does seem to have a very effective Sunrise review is Vermont, right next door. And you can just Google Vermont Sunrise Review and you'll see their law, which is very thorough and says that you know, it's the policy of the legislature that we want freedom of occupational choice. We want people to be able to practice the profession that they want, and that we can only regulate this in the interest of public safety when licensing is the least restrictive means necessary to achieve this end of public safety. And whenever a new licensing proposal comes up in Vermont, there's a department in state government that is tasked with reviewing all such proposals, and they post them online for everyone to view. And they've done a pretty good job, as far as I can tell, in vetting these and actually looking at what the consumer interest is. So Vermont, for instance, is the only state that doesn't license landscape architects. Which, you know, again, seems like a thing. I'm sort of surprised it's the only state that doesn't license this. I mean, maybe you might put a plant in the wrong spot or something. And you can see on the Vermont website that they have Sunrise reviews for landscape architects because they keep asking the legislature to regulate them, but they keep saying no. There's just no evidence that this is necessary for the consumer. So that. You know, that might be one state to look at as an example of effective, you know, putting up an effective sort of toll booth on new licensing regulations.
Concealed carry and shrubbery.
On the note of removing occupational licensing regulations, the momentum is definitely on the side of there being new licensing requirements. I did a comprehensive study a couple of years ago for the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and we looked at 40 years of sunset data, and we were only able to find 8 instances in the last 40 years where occupational licensing was removed. And that's not including the shampooer case in New Hampshire that just took place just this past summer. And in fact, in most of those cases, licensing was instituted very quickly soon after. For instance, Alabama, for a number of years, was the only state that didn't license barbers. From 1983 up until 2013, they did not license barbers. Sure enough, in 2013, the new law was passed, and now barbers are licensed. And there were a number of efforts over that 30-year period to relicense the profession. So these laws have remarkable staying power. I think it's really important once these laws get put forth, that there are careful considerations of what the costs and benefits are, because history tells us that these laws do have a tendency to stick around.
So what happened in it? Was there a Sweeney Todd case in Alabama with rogue barbers out?
Unfortunately, no. There was just continual pressure from the Board of Cosmetology. I think cosmetologists were facing increased competition from barbers, and cosmetologists were very much interested in barbers becoming licensed once more.
New Hampshire doesn't license a lot of professions that some other states do. For instance, didn't Florida license interior decorators? I mean, you trip over a hassock, it can be very dangerous. And the public should be protected from bad feng shui. I believe the Institute for Justice sued on that grounds. I mean, it's, for better or worse, if you don't like what the legislature is doing, you can always ask the courts. What is the legal landscape right now on challenges to occupational licensing? Do we know of any ongoing cases that are going on right now, or is it kind of normal?
I mean, I'm not an expert in this area, but I do try to keep up with some of these cases, and it seems to me that these laws run into trouble. Ryan mentioned the North Carolina case, Board of Dental Examiners. If states delegate too much authority to a private board to enact regulation, that seems apparently unconstitutional. If states try to regulate what you say, so DC tried to license tour guides, but on First Amendment grounds, you can't tell someone not to say, look, there's a building, it was built in 1783 or whatever.
New Hampshire does license travel guides, to be clear.
Okay. So maybe there's a First Amendment case for an enterprising lawyer out there. But and then there are some regulations that seem to just run afoul of the very lax rational basis test. So if there's no conceivable rationale for a law, then courts seem to be willing to strike it down. I believe there was a Kentucky law. This wasn't exactly an occupational license, but it was a barrier to entry that required moving companies to get the permission of existing moving companies before operating. And I think what happened there is it went to court, and then the state decided to settle by removing the law. But what that means is there are still some other states with laws like that for moving companies.
We have a question?
Hi, I'm John Lewicki from Mason, and I've been here for quite a few years, and I know some of the history, and we keep coming back to the cosmetology ones, and there is a long state legislator who, I don't know whether she's even still alive, who runs a cosmetology school, and while she was a state senator, many of these laws came into effect, and nobody's bothered to look at them since. And this is the kind of thing that happens. And honestly, once you've got a law in place that gives somebody a license, then there is always a lobby for the status quo.
Absolutely.
And we're not endorsing any changes to state law, but I notice you've got one of those nameplates. You felt like doing something about it.
Can I also just say about cosmetology, the interesting thing too, and that's a great point that you bring up, is that there are so many derivations of cosmetology that also require licenses. So to be a makeup artist in New Hampshire, you have to get a license. Now it's not 1,500 hours, but it's about half that much. To be a manicurist, to be a hair braider, actually in New Hampshire right now, you do have to get a full cosmetology license. So I mean, there are just a lot of different derivations from specific licensing requirements.
And looking at these laws and trying to shake up the status quo in a way, this is what sunset review is intended to do, right? So that the status quo action becomes reversion to no license. I think one of the reasons that this doesn't work in most cases is that it looks too extreme to the legislature. So Texas has a really comprehensive form of sunset review. Every state department is subject to sunset. And so the Department of Education comes up for sunset every few years in Texas. So of course they're not going to allow the Department of Education to go away. So what do legislators do? Well, this is a way for leadership in the legislature to attach to reauthorization of the department other little goodies that they would like. oh, you don't want the Department of Education to go away? Well, then fund this project of mine, right? So maybe an effective way to have sunset review is actually to make it more small scale and say that, for instance, this examination requirement will sunset or this education requirement will sunset rather than making whole departments subject to it.
Yeah, hi, Mike Harrington. I got a comment and a question. One of the comments a couple of things you hadn't mentioned here, and I'm not trying to give anybody the wrong idea because I certainly don't want the government getting involved in this, but there's two fields that I'm fairly familiar with that really involve life-threatening situations that the government stayed out of completely and they work very, very well. And that's scuba diving is the first one. There's no government requirement to get a license to go scuba dive. There's no government certification to be an instructor. It's all done by private organizations and basically enforced through insurance laws. People won't rent you equipment if you don't have a certification card because they're afraid of liability. But there's no government involvement in that. It's been going on for a number of years and it works really well. The other part is on guns. I mentioned a little bit about guns, but for example, I'm certified by the Massachusetts State Police to teach gun safety classes in Massachusetts. I've never taken any class from Massachusetts whatsoever. I've taken classes from the NRA. The NRA has a bunch of certified instructors. They instruct people that are certified to certify instructors. It's another example where no government involvement, no government stand is, it really works well and it keeps people safe. But it seems as if what I'm hearing from you, that was my comment, my question is, it's like inevitable we're going to keep getting more of these. Is there anything or anywhere where the people have been able to say, at least stop the damage, let's not let it go any farther, and then take a look back and see what we've got? Because it appears that we're just getting death by 1,000 cuts here, and each year something comes up, as you mentioned Alabama, it took them 20 years, but they never give up because, they're going to make a lot of money out of it, it's only going to cost everybody a little bit. You take a lot from, a little from a lot and give a lot to the few fight like hell to protect them. So, any positive things you can give us on that?
I would second the emphasis on really robust sunrise review. So I think it's not always exciting to talk about preventing new damage from occurring as opposed to trying to deal with some of these ridiculous examples we've discussed here. But it looks like it can be done right, and if you can expose proposals for new licensure to more scrutiny, to more cost-benefit analysis, and sort of establish a framework, a systematic framework where licensing is seen as the last resort, and voluntary certification is given more emphasis than it currently is. I think that's valuable, particularly as we know, the labor market is constantly changing. Occupations are disappearing and coming into existence, and over the years, if you can prevent new occupations from being licensed inappropriately, that's very valuable over the long run, because eventually the labor market will look quite different, and a lot of these groups that sort of have theirs in their existing occupation and are unlikely to relinquish that, those groups, those occupations may not even be around in that same form.
And I think one thing that we haven't talked about yet is expanding scope of practice. So if you look at especially the healthcare industry, one of the most important and fastest growing industries in the country, and especially in New Hampshire, you look at things, where can we expand the scope of practice? So what can a nurse practitioner do that maybe a doctor is doing today? What can a nurse practitioner do in the future? Examples like that, I think, are things that we can look to for positive reform.
I don't think it can be argued that any non-physician is a perfect substitute for a physician. But, if you think about, for instance, pharmacists, no other health profession has more training with respect to prescription drugs. And there likely is a broader role that pharmacists can play in the provision of healthcare. If we think about physical therapists, if we think about nurse practitioners, physician assistants, there are significant advances that can be made with respect to scope of practice that I think can potentially improve the quality of care, gets delivered to patients, and also potentially reduces costs.
How much friction is there between these differing state regulations when people move? They come here from New York, Connecticut, Colorado. They're licensed in that state, or their state doesn't have a license requirement. They come here, they try to get a job, and they don't qualify.
This is really, if you don't mind, this is very central to kind of my interests in labor economics. As a labor economist, I think we find really strong evidence that licensing barriers are reducing mobility workers across states. So, I mean, it's really striking, and we've seen in some work that I've been part of in different data sets that workers who are licensed will move at about the same rate within state as workers who are not licensed. And then when you look at movement across states, they're moving at a much lower rate than folks who aren't licensed. So, you know, it does appear that the licensing, you know, the need to become relicensed, to pay that fee, and to go through all of that extra paperwork and that hassle is a real barrier to that. And it's a particular problem for certain groups, right? So the Obama administration looked specifically at the spouses of military members, and you know, the need to constantly be moving across states was a real problem for them, for the spouses who were licensed, because they would continue to have to get, you know, that new license in the new state. And some progress was made there, but I think we could make progress much more broadly if we wanted to.
Okay, one question over here, then we'll bring the mic around to that side.
I'm Elizabeth Ralph. I'm a licensed acupuncturist. My question actually has to do with for-profit training programs in schools. You're spending a lot of time talking about licensure, but I can speak to my profession in that the only ones making any money in my profession are the people who run the schools and work at the schools. So what used to be a 2-year part-time program ballooned into a full-time 4-year program because the schools had access to federal student loan money. So if I were to put all of my credentialing initials on my business card, I'd need a bigger business card.
Very quickly, how much formal training did you think you needed before you could practice safely? You weren't masters yet, but you weren't going to be hurting your customers.
I had to take 3,000 hours of training. I don't think anyone needs 3,000 hours. I think there needs to be more direct clinical hours, and maybe you need theory, you need philosophy. Those are all really great things, but you also need more time practicing one-on-one on patients. I think the program could go back to being 2 years. I think there could be apprenticeship programs along with online study. I think there's a number of ways you can do it, but it shouldn't be a 4-year program on top of already having a bachelor's degree.
Maybe get the mic around to this side. How much of this is the credentialing industry protecting its demand?
That's probably part of it, and the legislature could, you know, one of the areas where our legislation affects profitability of these schools is in the continuing education requirements, right? And so that may be part of what's going on here. I'm not sure what New Hampshire's laws are for acupuncture, but that's definitely an area where schools have an incentive to lobby for more educational requirements for existing practitioners.
Can you imagine, though, if you graduated from high school and you have your high school diploma and you're being told by the school that you have to come back and take high school classes again in order to keep the validity of that diploma? I mean, that to me, I do agree, those seem like outrageous examples. It's almost equivalent to saying I have my high school diploma and I'm being called back to take world history again, you know, as a senior in high school. So I mean, thank you for sharing that story and your example with us.
Presenter.
Yes, I'm Carol McGuire. I'm in the legislature and I'm on the committee that deals with professional licensing. And I have 2 questions. One is, how do you deal with outside requirements for licenses? For example, the only reason landscape architects seem to want to be licensed is that if you don't have a license, you can't get a stamp, and therefore you cannot work on a federal contract. So that's there. Health professionals want to be licensed because insurance companies won't pay for the services of an unlicensed person. So that's a problem. The second issue that I have is that we see new professions coming in all the time to lobby for licensing, and most of them seem to think that the license is a government stamp of approval that says, yes, you're a profession, yes, you're validated, yes, you're a good guy. And how on earth do you deal with that?
Well, I think getting to the second question, I think a system of certification potentially can solve that problem. There are some states, for instance, massage therapists. Illinois does have a certification law in place. So if an individual would like to use the title certified massage therapist, they have to go through the various requirements to do so. If they choose not to, they don't have to go through the process. So I think certification potentially can solve that problem. Now, one issue with certification, though, is unfortunately too often it's a gateway towards licensing. There's too many instances that I've seen where a state will have a certification structure in place, and then ultimately a licensing regime will emerge. But I think at the very least, certification might present a way of solving that missing stamp of approval problem that professionals are seeking.
I would just add, I think this question gets at something really important and even a little deeper, which is that a lot of licensed professionals see the license as you said, as a sort of signal of the dignity of their work and the importance of their work. And I think that in addition to voluntary certification, which I think is helpful here, just really recasting the discussion in terms of licensing being a last resort for dealing with threats to public health and safety, and that is it. It is not the appropriate tool to simply try to raise quality in the profession or to deal with sort of other problems. It really needs to be focused on public health and safety. And I think with that reframing, hopefully it would be less often seen as that sort of stamp of approval.
And we know what the costs of licensing are. Licensing increases the wages of professionals by around 15%. It increases the prices of services anywhere from 3 to 15%. It erects significant barriers to entry. A lot of individuals are discouraged from entering professions as a result of these barriers being too high. So we know what these costs are. It just needs to be very clear with respect to how these laws are ultimately hurting the public before we start thinking about instituting them simply to make sure that professionals get that stamp of approval. There are less costly options available to accomplish that end.
Sure.
Hi, my name is Doug Smith. I'd just like to ask a question. How many occupational licensed professionals are in the room today?
How many what?
Licensed occupational professionals. Licensed people. Licensed occupational professionals.
Occupational license.
Licensed professionals. Who have a job that require a license?
How many people have credentials?
So wow, there's a lot here. I think it's excellent because when I got here, one of the first things they said was debate, and I think debate is a very good idea. I tend to line up with what I'm just reading about the Koch Institute. Deregulating is a pretty good idea. Over the past at least 8 years, or like 16, regulations have increased tremendously in this country. In this state over the past decade and a half, it's really gotten out of control. And so deregulating is a good idea. Demeaning professionals by making jokes about their jobs is not the way to start that. But moving on from that, I would say keep an open mind that licensed professionals do a job, and if they're doing it well, they have dignity, which is also a good thing, as you said. I agree with that. But they are there to protect, the general public. Licensed cosmetologists really should not fry anybody's hair when they're putting a perm on or a hair color. That can happen to you. I think a lot of women in this audience will know that. Some men. And so, well, this is a great idea today. I just read about it in the paper today and just kind of came in to see what's going on. I really appreciate what you have to say about educating. Just keep in mind that licensing is not a demon. It's not a terrible idea.
So, very personally for me, my grandmother was a babysitter. Didn't run a daycare. She was a babysitter for the neighborhood kids, 6, 8 kids at a time. And we'd go over to her house after school, 30-something years ago. And eventually the state kept telling her to get licensed. So eventually she gave it up. Didn't do it anymore. But then just, a month ago we had a case here in Nashville, I believe, of a young child who died at an unlicensed daycare center. I don't know the details of the case well enough to know whether that center was not in compliance in some way that led to that death. A couple hears about that. You have one dead child who seems to be too high a price to pay for deregulating a profession. That the downside, the worst case scenario, is worth a few inconvenient barriers, even if it means less economic growth.
I mean, I think the one thing to remember is, first of all, thank you for your comment. I think it's really important to put, we're talking about some things in the abstract, right? But you always have to put a human face on something. And I think let's not overlook the fact that licensed individuals are huge contributors to society. We depend on them for the services that we get every day. And so I don't ever want to overlook that fact. And I also don't want to overlook that many licensed professionals work very, very hard to get a license. They are very proud of it. Just like when we work hard to accomplish something, we all are entitled to that right, to work hard and to achieve and to get something from it. I think what we're trying to say is that we want to open up professions so that there are fewer barriers to entry, so that more people can have that sense of accomplishment, number one. And, I think to address your point, you're absolutely right. There are heart-wrenching examples of unlicensed, professions, things that happen, that we hear about, that we read about. The important thing to remember is there is so much variation when it comes to occupational licensing. I want to say, Ed, you probably have a better stat, but I think there are 11,000 occupational licensed professions in the U.S. And by the way, only 60 of them are common in every state. So there are a lot of things that tell us that maybe it's not all about health and safety and quality control. Those are the three stated reasons for an occupational license. I think the fact that there's so much variation, also the fact that a lot of times when you're looking at getting a new license, there are grandfathering clauses so that existing practitioners can be grandfathered in. Now, if it was entirely based on health, safety, and quality control, would you simply grandfather everyone in? I don't think so. I think, yes, it's important to kind of look at the examples that are heart-wrenching and that, see kind of where the licenses exist and where, what are some egregious examples of licensing requirements that could potentially be relooked at. But the reality is there's just a lot of variation.
We have a couple more people with their hands up that we'll try to get to before we wrap up. Sir?
I'm Dave Menson. I guess the question I have is, through the course of time, I've had 5 different licenses, both states and federal licenses. Each and every time, I was told, well, when you get this license, it will help you to become a better professional, okay, more knowledgeable, more understanding, etc., etc. Okay, each and every time I received my license, I knew next to nothing about that profession. Okay, I didn't learn anything about insurance or investments or real estate. What I learned is government regulations. Okay, I had to essentially roll up my sleeves and go in and learn the business. Okay, so I guess my question is if we're going to have to deal with this necessary evil, then why can't it at least be related to the fields that we're being asked to get involved in? And quite frankly, from my experience, they are not. Thank you.
Is this training effective and actually improving quality?
I mean, I think at best the evidence is mixed. I mean, part of it is that quality is subjective, and it can be very difficult to get at that issue. But the studies that have looked at, and to Ryan's point, for most of these, we are looking at situations where there's differences in licensing. It's very difficult to tease out what the effect of licensing is if it is ubiquitous. But the evidence is mixed. There's not compelling evidence that licensing is in fact enhancing quality. And in too many instances, like the gentleman said, it's questionable about what the training is actually adding with respect to the quality of service. I mean, hair braiding, for instance, in too many instances, individuals have to get a license as a cosmetologist to work as a hair braider, yet the cosmetology training contains very little, and in many cases no, training whatsoever on hair braiding. So why make an individual become a licensed cosmetologist to work as a hair braider if the training itself contains no information on hair braiding? There are a number of states that are cracking down on individuals engaged in animal massage. Veterinarians are claiming that if you give an animal massage or you help them file their teeth, that you are in fact engaging in working as a veterinarian. It's very questionable if one has to become licensed as a veterinarian just to give a horse a massage or to help file their teeth. Interestingly enough, veterinarians don't want anything to do with the back of the animal. When it comes to castration, anyone can castrate a horse, but when it comes to horse filing or when it comes to animal massage, you have to be a veterinarian in order to be able to do that job. So there are too many instances, like the gentleman said, where it appears that the requirements don't match up with the quality of the service.
So, yeah, we hear a lot today about inequality. How can occupational licensure reform help some of the poorest of the poor in our country, and what reforms have helped lift people out of poverty?
To get a crack at that, I think that we have a strong basis in economic theory to think that inappropriately burdensome occupational licensing is going to be a particular problem for people of limited means, right? Because when you need thousands of hours of training and thousands of dollars to pay these fees, the people who aren't going to be able to meet those, and exceed those barriers are going to be people with low incomes. So, I think we have just a strong presumption that occupational licensing is a problem for inequality. There's something that touches on this that I wanted to bring up quickly, which is the problem that licensing often presents for people with criminal records. So that's another big piece of this that I think the public is kind of just fairly recently becoming aware of. And there are many Americans with some form of criminal record. There are many licensing statutes that that will prevent those people with the records from working, even when the work that's being done in the occupation has little or nothing to do with the offense, or if the offense is quite distant in the distant past.
Sometimes when there's no conviction,
that's right.
Licensing board.
And I've seen cases where it's it's a misdemeanor and something that just has nothing to do with the work that we're talking about. So that's a big problem when it comes to inequality and really just to access to work for people that we really want to have access to work.
I think that's right. And I think there have been studies, and Ed, you probably know more about this, but basically that shows there is a direct impact of more stringent occupational licensing laws on recidivism. I think in states where there are tougher occupational licensing or more occupational licensing laws, recidivism is quite substantially higher.
Yeah, Steve Slavinsky did a study taking a look at the toughness of occupational licensing laws and recidivism. And he did in fact find that states that have stricter occupational licensing laws do in fact have higher recidivism rates. I think if we want individuals to be rehabilitated, I think having a job, having some dignity in a job is one of the best ways to go about doing that.
I would just add really quick, New Hampshire is a great state in this regard, in that it has a strong statute that basically says that you can't categorically bar someone from employment without some sort of specific finding that that conviction they have would present a problem for the work. So many states do not have that, and I've argued in the past to others that they should implement this sort of thing that New Hampshire has here.
Excellent. Final question.
My name is Will Anderson. Jason, I was intrigued by your mention of Vermont seemingly having fewer introduced licenses because of a rigid sunrise review process. I sort of gathered that you kind of implied that was sort of a cultural thing. I don't know where that would have developed, but I was just wondering if you or anybody else on the panel has any suggestions on how we can get toward more of a system like that in New Hampshire.
Well, it's just a statute that they passed. I think it dates back to 1977. A number of states passed these in the 70s. but Vermont actually enforces it. A lot of other states don't seem to enforce it. Vermont and Colorado seem to be the two states that really do well in terms of enforcing sunrise review. Another idea is it would be interesting to see some state enact some kind of constitutional right to occupational freedom and see what courts might do when confronting that. They might subject these licenses to something a little bit more than rational basis review and actually require some demonstration of a public safety benefit to allow the license.
Yeah, I know Minnesota has a rather patriotic piece of legislation, House Bill, or Senate Bill, I think 1776, that is seeking to do just that.
Excellent. Thank you all very much for your time. And Jason, Ed, Dana, and Ryan, thank you. Excellent panel, excellent discussion. We look forward to tracking this issue in New Hampshire and across the nation. Thank you.